Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Unbreaking Science. I'm Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, coming to you live from hilly Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, through the WWDNYK studios. We're going to be going in deep tonight on an important topic. We're going to be talking about HPV vaccines, HPV vaccine safety, the status of the science, and what we know. And I have pulled together a panel who are really the go-to people to keep up on where we are today. I'm really happy to have with us um, Mary Holland, Mack Rosenberg, and Eileen Iorio. So welcome, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
Right on. So this is the fabulous tome that has circulated since you've published this, and there's too much acclaim to those of us who are objective and open-minded. The HPV Vaccine on Trial, this book, played a very seminal role actually here in Allegheny County politically, as you recall, as I was nearly thrown out of Allegheny County courthouse for daring to ask a point of order clarification on a process because they should have had open discussion and they tried to skip over and push through an HPV vaccine. It turns out that the week later after that, the entire Allegheny County Council received a copy of your book, and it was like a movie script, honestly. A bunch of us showed up to give some comments. One of the Allegheny County Council members gave a scathing indictment of the Allegheny County Board of Health for skipping over, due process as is required by the legislature here in Pennsylvania. And at the end of the meeting, the clerk handed out to each council member a copy of your book. It couldn't have gone better. It was just like it was timed perfectly. So I had mailed them in a couple of days before, had no idea. It was like, all right, perfect. That was beautiful. So I have a couple of questions for you guys. I mean, there's been so many distractions. I thought I'd pull this all together and have a rational discussion, given the nightmare of a train wreck that happened last night and that social interaction between two people on television, the presidential debates. Um, let's talk about the book itself first. Its reaction, the reaction to the book, some of the questions people had about the book, unfounded criticisms, and what parts of the book did they really not understand? That's what I'd like to start with.
Hmm.
I think Eileen can speak to sort of the interactive world of Twitter and Facebook. But I would just say, Jack, sort of a regret is it's very hard to reach the mainstream media on anything related to vaccines that's not, strictly promotional. So even though we, did several YouTube shows and radio and that kind of thing, we really never got to network media. So, that we didn't really get to a wide audience very easily. But I think Eileen is the most experienced in interfacing on our website and on Twitter about the book.
Yeah, so let's take a moment to settle some scores here. There's some
Mhm.
mischaracterization of some of the material in there. And of course, it always comes with ad hominem attacks. That's not what I want to talk about because those don't
Yeah.
matter. What I want to talk about is whether or not there was a moment in time when you said, I see what they're just not getting. The material's right in front of them and they're misinterpreting it. Maybe intentionally. So,
Jack, I think it was the opposite. I think
okay.
it was intentional blackout.
Yeah.
We have heard nothing from the more prolific commentators on the other side. We've heard nothing. We heard a little bit of back and forth on Twitter, but nobody addressed it. We had there was talks of, and there was actually inroads to a book review by Dorit and a couple of her cohorts, but it was unfinished. Well, at least the last time I'm talking about Dorit Rice, the last time we even looked at it was 2 years ago, and we paid no mind because the criticisms were just the usual things that they assumed were in the book. It was as if they didn't read it. So that's why, we didn't feel like there was any criticism. And the reason was because the accusations laid down were so serious. We came up with never before seen or read about accusations against the company, outlined, missteps and malfeasance in the clinical trials that people hadn't talked about before. And these are things that quote unquote, the other side don't want to talk about. Things like, the youngest clinical trial used what looked like a fraud, misrepresented the placebo for the youngest group and gave half the aluminum that is now, given to children out in the market. So there's things in there like lack of informed consent for the biggest trial in Europe, which we assume extended to the US, where they didn't tell the girls that the placebo was spiked. So, we had evidence of all of that. They lied, they told the girls it was saline. So that in of itself is, I hate to use the word fraud, but it is going to court on that basis. And Kim will talk about that later. So that's really what I think. It was more the silence validated our book than anything. And, on Amazon, we have 150 5-star reviews, 1 star. So that will tell you.
Yeah. So,
and I think that,
go ahead.
The one criticism that I hear and see on Twitter, and I'm sure Eileen does as well, is, well, they just spewed a bunch of nonsense and they have nothing to support what they say.
Right.
And those are people who I know have never picked up the book because we have 100 pages of footnotes. And so many of the studies and research articles we cite are, from people at NCI and people at NIH, and it's Merck's own documents and it's FDA's own documents. And we're not citing, deep, dark, websites that no one's ever seen before in their lives. We're citing very solid mainstream science for a lot of these propositions.
Absolutely. So,
and that's uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, certainly. So if your book was given to, it must have reached legislators, for instance. It must have reached the FDA. It, certainly. And the silence is in itself, it does speak volumes, and it's certainly unacceptable. So it's good to know that there's some pending legal action, which we'll get to in a little while. We've been through gyration after gyration of drama in society. The infrastructure of science seems to be stretched, to the breaking point, with the Cochrane Foundation splitting up over this of absolute, Peter Gotch's criticism, of course, of their HPV vaccine safety review, which was heavily influenced by the CDC. Those kinds of gyrations also are the kind of thing that should make someone say, wait a minute, why would a lifelong scientist, 20, 30 years of making contributions on objective science, all of a sudden say, hey, wait a minute, what you guys did on that safety report, there's some serious problems, and here's what they are. Other than those kinds of things, I think people are really curious at this point in time. What are any new developments, anything about people that have read your book? Well, if you haven't read the book, please do. It's incredibly thorough. What has come to light since your book that you would like to people to know about?
I think, Jack, the HPV story is kind of expanding, but I don't think it's fundamentally changed, really. There's more continuity than there is change. But I think one of the things that we find striking, and we've discussed in preparation for this conference, is we did a really deep dive in the clinical trials of sort of new technology vaccine. And this is what we're now observing with COVID-19. And so for us, the parallels are quite extraordinary. And when you think that, we think that the HPV vaccine is inherently unsafe for very substantial, groups of people. And it took them, many years, over a decade of development. And we're now watching development in under 12 months. It's really frightening to us what is going on. But many of the same tricks and traps of, false placebos, and really looks like big clinical trial groups, but the actual decision making is on a very small number. Not categorizing things as they really are, giving things the right names. Those are all things that really sound very familiar to us as we're listening to what's happening with COVID vaccines.
Okay, so the message in the book is still pretty much the current state of knowledge. There was nothing else that came to light, new evidence of, fraud in the trials, no whistleblowers or anything like that have stepped forward.
Well, you mentioned Peter Götze from Denmark. I mean, he has undertaken an enormous investigation into never-before seen trials. He accused the Cochrane collaboration, well, Cochrane now as it's known, of not seeking out the unpublished trials. So he pointed out that there is more information out there, and in fact, nobody has seen the full block of information that we should be entitled to see in order for scientists to make a determination as to safety. So his criticisms, stop at the door of, okay, now I need more information. So he was very heavily criticized for it, and eventually lost his career, his research grants, not his credibility. He has a lot of support, but he got, I hate to use the term Wakefielded, but that's what we come to know as the term for admonishing scientists and, ending and career-ending stuff. But but as regards what's happened since, not so much by way of our research. We've been very busy on other projects, which we'll get to. But for Merck, they've expanded their market. They've added boys to the schedule in the UK, which is a huge market. They're pushing it out they're pushing out the male market narrative to other countries in Europe. And of course, Gardasil 9, which is a more expensive vaccine, that has now become the main vaccine in Europe. It was Gardasil 4 up until 2 years ago. So that has been a slower rollout. So it's all in all, they've doubled their earnings, probably around, I don't know if it's quite doubled, but it's certainly increased by 50%. Part of that is the move into China. So there's been a lot going on for Merck. They've expanded.
I think one thing that's interesting, though, and I think two things that just as we were going to press, so I don't even know that we touch on this in the book, we may not have had a chance to, was that Peter Doshi got a ruling from a Canadian court that Health Canada had to release a substantial amount of Merck's clinical trial data. And I believe his investigation into that is still ongoing. So that could yield some very interesting information. The other thing is, as Eileen said, as Merck is expanding its market, they're also sort of going through, we talked about this the other day, kind of an unbranding of Gardasil. So if you look at the new Gardasil advertisements, both on television and on their website, which is now called, I think, hpvvaccination.com or hpvvaccine.com, there's no mention of the word Gardasil. And it's a very angry, frightening website. It's black and white and yellow. And it's parents standing in front of their children to protect their children. But the word Gardasil isn't there, and Merck's logo is in tiny, tiny size in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, at the very bottom of the web page. And it talks about, there's a little change of tactic, right, as they're encouraging you to get it. Now it's not even so much of, they're having to admit that most cases of HPV clear up. But now the tactic is, well, we don't know who is going to be that small percentage. And that's simply not true. We know, sort of generally speaking, what those risk factors are for people who go on to develop persistent infections. So it's still very misleading, but I thought the unbranding of Gardasil as if Gardasil has become a dirty word.
That's fascinating. So I want to read you guys something from the CDC website. See if you can help me make sense of it. You're the smartest trio that I know of, and the most experienced in listening to this bullcrap. Science. This is the CDC's recommendations that have to do with older people, not teens, not the original market. Vaccination is not recommended for everyone older than age 26 years. However, some adults ages 27 through 45 years may decide to get the HPV vaccine based on discussion with their clinician if they did not get adequately vaccinated when they were younger. HPV vaccination of people in this age range provides less benefit for several reasons, including that more people in this age range have already been exposed to HPV. Now, one of the most important things that this team here on Unbreaking Science reported in their book was I happened to be in New York at the time, and Mary called me into her office. I think Kim was there too.
I was there.
And you guys said, is this possible? You pointed out some data from Merck that showed that older women had negative efficacy. What is negative efficacy, and why is that important for people that are over the age of 25 who their clinician is saying, you know what, you didn't get that vaccine way back in 1972 or whenever. You probably want to get it. Tell the listeners about, or the viewers about negative efficacy in the HPV trials.
I would love to talk about that, Jack. So that's right. Way back when, Kim and I were asking you, could this possibly mean what we think it means, which is that this vaccine in people who have been exposed to these who have antibodies to this infection or who have an active infection, they actually are more likely to get dysplasia, more likely to get abnormal cervical growth or to develop cancer from getting this vaccine. And it, we were shocked, and you helped us recognize, yes, that's what it means. And I am now no longer at NYU where I was. I'm now with Children's Health Defense, and I'm very happy that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., our chair, sent a letter to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices last February 2019, specifically about their intended recommendation for adults aged 27 to 45. And we said, if you go forward with this reckless recommendation, we are going to hold your feet to the fire. We're going to hold you accountable, because adults, for the most part, who've been sexually active have come in contact with all of these types of HPV. And so they are going to be at increased risk, according to Merck's own data, of developing abnormal cervical growth or other abnormal precancerous growth. So we really reamed them for this potential recommendation. And the only thing that we can sort of say was a positive is that they didn't make a full-throated recommendation to adults, Jack. Possibly in response to the letter, they said, well, we're going to leave it to the adults and their clinicians. We're not going to make a full-scale recommendation like they do to children. And that's a positive, because for sure, this vaccine is not only ineffective, which they basically state, but more significantly for us, it appears to be dangerous.
Yeah, the data clearly say that. The data clearly say negative efficacy means that there's more dysplasias. The CIN condition in the older women who got the vaccine, and that seems to be buried. It wasn't made, and the FDA just turned a blind eye to it. What was FDA's response to those data?
Well,
that was part of the FDA submission, right?
Well, I think what's interesting about what the FDA did, and it wasn't. That wasn't in the older women. That was actually in the 16 to 26-year-olds.
Yeah.
But it was a subset of one of the phase 3 trials. It was protocol 13. But what was interesting about these women who had this negative efficacy was that they were women who were obese, or they were smokers, who had long-term use of oral hormonal contraceptives. And FDA kind of dismissed that as, oh, these women had these other things going on. And to us, those other things are real world risk factors that are much more prevalent in the general population than in the trial study group even, so that the risk is greater to everyone out there. And then when you look at things like smoking and obesity, when you look at older people, in their 30s and in their 40s, those numbers go up as well. So that's a very big concern.
Excellent. So we see it in coronavirus as well. There's a bad outcome. They say it's probably due to something else, right? The neurological demyelinating disorders. And I recently had this kind of like crystallization of a thought about how we communicate what this is. They say that the level of evidence for attributing autism
and you need to go, sweetie.
Sorry. You need to go for a minute?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I turned it off.
Okay.
The phone. No, it's not for us.
Right there.
The crystallization of this thought was that specifically the level of evidence that they require for anyone to say that there's something attributed causally to a vaccine is very high. But then they bring in what they call confounders. And by bringing in confounders like the smoking and the age or whatever it is that they bring in and they correct for these, the level of evidence that they require to attribute causality to confounders is zero. They don't require the same level of evidence to attribute it to smoking or anything else like that. And they can say, well, everybody knows this or everybody knows that. But by the same token, there's a difference between a confounder and a risk factor. A confounder is something statistically where the functional relationship is known between the outcome and the covariate, whereas a co-risk factor actually works with the vaccine and increases risk. And that's what you guys are saying. You're saying that these are not totally independent factors, that there may be a causal link mechanistically between these lifestyle choices like smoking and
well, and we know that those are real world, and I don't think anyone from NCI or NIH or FDA would argue with us that those are real world risk factors for cervical cancer. I mean, that's very well established.
It's on the American Cancer Society website.
Right.
And when FDA went to approve the older age cohort of 28 to 45, they did mention that risk, and they patted themselves on the back for saying, oh, well, we made that go away, or we explained it away to ourselves, and we'll just keep an eye on that. So they didn't do any further study. They alluded to the Costa Rica study and saying, oh, we didn't find that there, so therefore it doesn't exist. But that wasn't really sound science, as you know, because they're totally different.
Exactly. So the level of evidence problem then combines with what Kim's talking about, the real world application of vaccines. They don't say if you're a smoker, don't get the HPV vaccine. They don't say if you have these risk factors, don't get it. They simply say we explained it away, and everybody should get the HPV vaccine.
If they really cared about reducing deaths from cancer, smoking would be the one thing that they would admonish, but that isn't the case. And so we just know the answer to that.
We know it, but the listeners don't understand that when a pediatrician says you are now protected against HPV, that's a gross overgeneralization, right down to the type of HPV virus strain, that the vaccine only targets certain amounts. So, that strange wording on that weird recommendation, if that's attributed to the Health Choice Children's Health Defense letter, that's fantastic.
They were contemplating, Jack, a full-throated recommendation for all adults. And the fact that didn't happen is very atypical. And we don't know if it was due to us, but we take credit where we can. Victories are few and far between still. And the fact that they're not pushing this on every adult through age 45 is a blessing, because those are people who are really at risk from being injured.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to finish this off, of course, we have I don't know if you guys know, I had 16,000 followers on LinkedIn, and I recently got booted off of LinkedIn specifically for daring to propose a program that would decentralize public health in the United States. They specifically pointed to that article in an email to me, but I also had an article where I boiled down the data on the increased risk of cervical cancer found in the population level data from the UK. And it's not just my analysis. There are other people that have done an analysis here too. There's a
Right.
very, very important. We'll talk about that. What do you know about the increase? There's another website here that I bring up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
this, and here's the
you
link
should.
to that. Hmm.
I think what scientists or investigators should do is look at the UK in lockstep with Australia, because we found the exact. I don't know if it's you know you know I don't know if the rate is the same, but in young women there is an increase in cervical cancer. Now, usually, they would have a reason, or there would be something. The UK is very good at keeping registries, and they can't explain this one. Especially in Australia, where we saw a marked increase in the very young, and both these countries are highly vaccinated. So, beginning 2007, 2008, they had immediate high uptake. So, so that's 12 years now. So they also offered the vaccine to the age of 18 for free. So in a socialized medicine, or socialized medicine in the UK, and then in Australia you had it offered in schools. So that was the reason for the very high uptake. And so I think it's definitely something that should be looked at. There's been no explanation. It's actually been ignored, because what's happening is they're looking at rates of cervical cancer overall, which were going down anyway due to successful PAP screening programs, beginning 20 years ago in both countries. And the success of PAP screening is now, skewing the total numbers in favor of the vaccine somehow, because there's a very slight decline in overall cervical cancer rates. But once you break down the numbers by age, you see that's attributable to the over 55s, over 65s, due to PAP screening. And Kim knows more about this than me, and I hope she takes over. But the whole PAP screening program is now being dismantled throughout the world, which is now putting young people more at risk. So the increase in cervical, so I'll just finish on, and please take over in a sec, but the increase, I think, in the UK can be boiled down to 4 reasons. So either vaccine confidence, overconfidence where they're not attending screening, vaccine failure, or young women got vaccinated when they already had HPV because the program was offered to older women, young girls and women who could be sexually active. So the failure, I think I said that already, not going for PAP screen. So, and now they're dismantling the PAP screening program in favor of HPV testing, which Kim did a lot of research on.
So one of the things that's very concerning, again, as Eileen pointed out, this rise in cervical cancer among very young women. And one of the things that has been studied is that, in particular, among girls who get the vaccine at a very young age, those 9, 11, 12-year-olds who get it, their rate of cervical cancer screening in the US, Australia, and other higher resource countries seems to be going down. And no one is sure completely why. In part, there's a dismantling of the screening in later ages for first screenings and that type of thing. But these girls seem to be missing those screenings when they reach that age. And we know anecdotally that parents go in with their 9-year-old or their 10-year-old or 11-year-old to the pediatrician's office, and the pediatrician says to mom and to the girl, or to the girl, if you get this shot, you won't get cervical cancer, which, as we know, is a gross overrepresentation of anything. Mm-hmm. But then everyone thinks this girl is completely protected from cervical cancer, which is not the case. And no one is thinking, we suspect, quite possibly in most cases, that a pediatrician is going to say to a 9-year-old, well, you have to remember when it's time for you to go see the OBGYN that you have to get screened. That's, at that point, if you're 9 or 10, that's more than 10 years down the line for you at this point in most countries. And there is a move toward, there's always this balancing between overscreening and underscreening, because overscreening does pick up more CIN1 lesions, most of which, over 90% of which resolve on their own. So there is some spreading out of screening. But now they are switching to this HPV DNA test, which uses the same sample, by the way, as the Pap smear scrape. So it's not unreasonable to do both, and some places absolutely do both. You've got the sample. But there is a move toward just doing the DNA testing where you're not examining the cells for changes at that cellular level that you want to catch.
There absolutely is. I've had the pleasure of reading a blockbuster book that's coming out by Dr. Singhang Lee, and this is going to be a massive embarrassment to the establishment because he names names. It wasn't just a bunch of doctors that got together and said, maybe we don't need to do so many Pap smears anymore. I mean, it opened up the possibility of the rationale for a vaccine, right? It was intentional, 100%. And Singhang Lee is one of the most ardent supporters of molecular diagnostic testing that you could imagine. I mean, you would think that this guy would, let's have the HPV test just go to molecular PCR or sequencing or something. Yeah. But no, he's like, no, you guys really, really are doing population level damage here. It's an indictment, and it's really going to be quite a bombshell.
And he spells it out very clearly, the risks. But what's added to that is that they're recommending that you space them out more now because we have this excellent test that's so accurate. Caveat, it's not. But, that I'm not an expert in that. But the problem is that they're being told you don't have to come back for 5 years. This is in Europe. I mean, to American women, that's shocking because we've been trained. Well, I didn't grow up here, but, American women get Pap smears every 1 or 2 years.
So but it's not the standard of care in America anymore for 1 or 2 years either.
Okay.
They've spaced it out here as well. And I think, one of the other causes of concern is that some of the cervical cancer that we're seeing in these very young women is very virulent cancer. It's much faster growing than the cervical cancer that we see in older women. And if you're spacing out your screenings,
right.
If you have cancer that's growing more quickly, it's troubling.
Well, I think, Kim, you're raising this issue of type replacement, right, Jack? That, by taking out these sort of more common cancer-associated strains, nature abhors a vacuum. It may be the more virulent strains that then become more prevalent and may really be causing cancer in these younger girls.
Yeah, and actually your book has one of the analyses that I did. I'm trying to find this slide where I reanalyzed the CDC's public data on this, and I showed that type replacement is happening, and we cited, 4 or 8 different studies that showed type replacement. What we're really talking about is when they seized upon the initial 4 and then the 9, they said these are the ones that that are associated with the largest number of cancers. That doesn't make them the most deadly. It makes them the most benign because they're the highest in number. Right. And the data totally support type replacement. But let's go back to the increased incidence of aggressive cancers from what Kim said earlier. The Pap smear involves a scraping. And people don't understand this, but I learned this when I was in the Department of Pathology at the University of Pittsburgh and at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute. That's a curative diagnostic. You're actually taking the cells out of the body to examine them under the microscope. So you do a visual inspection of the cervix, you find the lesions, you remove all the lesions. In fact, it is malpractice to leave any lesions during a Pap smear. Okay? And so it's a curative treatment. To space out Pap smears actually means you're allowing those cells to stay resident and to grow. And it's not enough simply to say it could be these other things. It's a massive change in the medical practice of treatment. Right. And so that point needs to be addressed.
The HPV test is only checking for HPV 16 and 18, and then it groups together a category of other high-risk types. So you will not have the data on what other strains are becoming prevalent to the point we were making about the type replacement. So we're not going to have the data unless it's probed further. But I've spoken to a number of women who've tried to get more information on the strains that were found other than 16 and 18, and that wasn't available. So I don't know.
Listen,
well, you also don't know that the real risk isn't just an HPV infection per se, right? It's a persistent HPV infection that's causing that, the inflammation, the trajectory that follows the inflammation. So if you have only 16 and 18 being broken out and you have pooled results for the other types, and you test positive twice, two tests in a row for the pooled results, you don't know if you have a persistent infection or if you've been infected with two different types and you just happen to have gotten, two different types of HPV. You'll never know.
Well, actually, I think that we will, because the ecologists, when they ever get the data, they actually look at this competitive exclusion principle. It's a very well established principle in ecology, and the fact that the ecologists have analyzed the data and they say that there is type replacement, the data are strongly supportive of type replacement, not just in the studies that the CDC did, certainly. But there's science will out. You cannot hide type replacement when they start doing phylogenetics and they say, wait a minute, HPV 16 and 18, the vaccine targeted are declining. The vaccine targeted types are declining, so we'll know that from molecular sequencing. And yet the vaccine non-targeted types are, now we have to expand the vaccine. That itself is evidence of type replacement.
Right. Well, I was thinking, Jack, more on an individual level, right? A woman who goes in and gets an HPV DNA test and is positive for the pooled results, and they say, come back, 6 months, a year later, we're going to test you again, and she's positive again for the pooled results. She doesn't know if she has a persistent infection or if she's just had two serial infections of different types.
No, I totally agree with that. Absolutely.
The level of care has changed. The level of care for women has changed. And now with this pandemic, God only knows what's going to happen in the next few years to these poor women.
Totally. So listen, I'm going to try to get Josh on the phone here. He tried to call in, but while I'm doing that, tell me about what's going on at SaneVax. What's going on there?
I just did a look. So you mentioned Dr. Lee, and we talk quite a bit about Dr. Lee in the book. And Norma Erickson, who's the founder and sort of driving force behind SaneVax, started a partnership with Dr. Lee very early because he recognized that people needed to be screened before they would get an HPV vaccine. SaneVax is continuing to do just an outstanding job of connecting people who've been injured by the HPV vaccine with physicians, with lawyers, with other people. Frida Burrell is their kind of major force in Europe. And between Norma and Frida, they really are connected with the main activists and advocates and physicians who are working on this around the world.
Excellent.
I think, Jack, we would be remiss not to tell you about the exciting lawsuits that are going on against Merck for their fraud with Gardasil. And I think Kim can speak to that most eloquently.
Yeah, please do.
So there are now 4 lawsuits that have been filed on behalf of people who have been injured by HPV vaccines. There's Roby, which is the furthest along, and that's in Superior Court in Los Angeles County in California. And that was filed in 2016, and we're in the discovery phase of that case now. So we are fighting with Merck over documents, and that will be ongoing. But there have been cases filed on behalf of 2 other young women, one in Rhode Island and one in Arizona, who have different injuries. One is a POTS case, and one is another type of autoimmune disorder. And there's been a case filed on behalf of a young man. Also, I believe in California, that case was just filed. So things are moving forward on that front. Roby is sort of the leading case in that it was the first filed, but these cases have been filed. It's a very interesting and exciting time. As you know, it's very difficult to get a case out of the VICP and into civil court, and there are allegations, obviously, of fraud and wrongdoing in all of these cases.
Okay, so you're using that opportunity. What's the relief that's being sought, if you can discuss that?
Sure. So, there's monetary damages for these people who have been injured. That is the primary relief that's being sought. I'm not sure, Mary, are they requesting that the vaccine be pulled off the market?
No, that's not among the questions.
These are really individual cases brought on behalf of injured people. So they're seeking damages related to their injuries and their ongoing need for medical care and treatment. Okay. As you know, Jack, many of these people who have been injured and who survive have catastrophic injuries that are absolutely life-changing for themselves and their families.
Absolutely.
And it's very costly.
You all have been interviewed in great detail over the cases that you chose to review in the book about people that were on the trial that were given the wrong, they were lied to about the placebo. It was actually aluminum, and the health effects of that on them individually. And if that could be seen on an individual basis, it's pretty profound. So this lawsuit's being run through which organization?
So Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the chair of Children's Health Defense, has partnered with 3 major plaintiffs' law firms in the country, Jack. And what we expect may happen if any one of these cases or a few of these cases are successful is what we saw with Vioxx. And one of the things that we write about in the book is the initial name for the HPV vaccine, human papillomavirus, the acronym was Help Pay for Vioxx, right? Because Vioxx was a disaster. Bad news was clear from the clinical trials. They hid it. It was a fraud. And after a couple successful cases, basically they had to put up close to a $5 billion settlement fund. And then Merck also paid criminal and civil sanctions. And our hope and expectation is that something very similar will happen. And they took Vioxx off the market. And so our subtitle for our book, The HPV Vaccine on Trial, is Seeking Justice for a Generation Betrayed. And it's our greatest hope that these lawsuits will break through. And there are also lawsuits that have been filed around the world, in India, in Denmark, in Colombia, in Australia, and and in Japan, and we follow those in the book. And Spain. And so it's our hope that we will these cases, we hope that the book has contributed in some way, but these cases will break through and basically force the corporation to set up a settlement fund and then to take this vaccine off the market because they just have lied. They've demonstrably lied about what the vaccine does and what they know.
Yeah, so
and we're happy that the firms that are working on this, for example, Baum Hedlund, which is a major firm on the West Coast, they're very familiar with products liability cases like this. So Baum Hedlund and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. worked on some of the Monsanto cases. They've worked on major cases where personal injury has occurred as a result of products that cause damage.
100%. I was going to say that the same team was involved in breaking ground in glyphosate and Roundup, and we saw what happened. Just a lawsuit, the successful lawsuit, a ruling, an award, and of course the legal community says, okay, let's go for it. So listen, I wanted your input on what citizens can do in their own states as these policymakers look at this warped science, look at the misinformation that's come to them. And if you don't mind hanging out a little bit, I want to talk about this a little bit after we talk to Josh, because first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play a video. I'm sure you guys have seen this. This is a 3-minute video. Let's take a look at what Josh did in the Maryland State School of Board meeting.
Good morning, board members. I'm Josh Mazer from Annapolis, Maryland. Thank you for the opportunity to address you. I've come to express my concern over State Senator Clarence Lamb's proposal to mandate HPV vaccination as a requirement to get a free, fair, appropriate public education in the state of Maryland. Clarence Lamb made his remarks at the HPV Symposium in March of 2018. And what he said is that he and the Maryland State Department of Health are involved in systematic preparations to make this mandate a reality within the next year or two. I think this is a bad idea. The justification for the program, Dr. David Blythe, the Maryland State Chief Epidemiologist, put out a note in June of 2019, and Dr. Blythe said, look at Australia for the super result that we're getting from this shot. So what I did was I looked at Australia, and I'm sorry that the graph you have is unclear. This one's a little better. This one shows that prior to the introduction of the HPV shot in Australia, there was a 40-year decline in HPV cervical cancers because of pap smears and because of education. The introduction of the HPV shot happened here. We've gone from approximately 700 cervical cancers in Australia up to almost 1,000. I'm confused why Dr. Blythe would point to Australia as an example of the success of this program when we see this amazing, concerning spike in cervical cancers after the introduction of the shot. A possible explanation for the increase in cervical cancers after the introduction of the HPV vaccine is found in the FDA licensing documentation. And I provided that for you. This is called the VARBAC. And the VARBAC shows on the lower right of your graph, certain cohorts of kids who received the shot are 44% more likely to develop cervical lesions or precancers than kids who don't get the shot. And you can read this with your own eyes. It's in the FDA licensing documentation. So that raises the question, what exactly is driving this program in Maryland? Why are we moving towards this? Why is Clarence Lamb, State Senator Lamb, and the Maryland Department of Health pushing for this? In my Public Information Act requests, at the same conference that State Senator Lamb made his remarks that he wants to mandate this within the next 1 or 2 years, and he's making systematic preparations to do so, we found this slide. And this slide says that the State Department of Health is promoting, this is a green dollar sign, so we have to assume that this is money. They're promoting cash bonuses, not to physician practices, not to medical practices. This word says physician. They are promoting cash money bonuses to physicians in the state of Maryland to increase the uptake of this shot. This makes me very nervous as a parent. It concerns me that when I go to my doctor, the medical advice they're providing to my family is not based on their judgment. It could be based on this green dollar sign. I urge the state board to push back on this. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's see if we can get Josh here. Josh, are you there? Josh, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Jack. I am here.
Okay, good. So well done. We just watched your video on Unbreaking Science here, and we're sharing it, and we put up the websites. So I wanted to congratulate you, and the ladies, I'm sure, wanted to say that too, but you can't hear them. So what's going on in Maryland, and what is it about your strategy that has them against the wall? I mean, you seem to have fractionated part of the government against itself, the people that want to distance themselves from these, are they illegal moves? I don't know. You describe it for us.
Well, first of all, Jack, thank you very much. And I also wanted to say that the work that I've done in Maryland has been focused on following the money. And Mary Holland, Mack Rosenberg, as well as Eileen, have been tremendously helpful to me. Each of these individuals have been very generous with their time in helping move this project forward. So the way that we have approached the issue in Maryland of the state legislator wanting to mandate the shots or, using our children as a receptacle for the shot to capture money, to actually go to Merck, but selling out our kids' body just to put the shot into, really it's just a question of educating the legislators. And we have developed a mailing list. We have a rather comprehensive mailing list. We include PTAs, various parent organizations. We try and get the mailer out to tens of thousands of people, and we just try to put the facts in front of them. And as we have done this over time, there's been a good response where people call us and ask questions. We've gotten some media attention. The big picture here, as highlighted by Mary's book, Mary and Kim's book, this HPV shot, for people who love shots or hate shots, this particular shot is low-hanging fruit. There's enough controversy around this particular shot that people really need to pay attention to it. The aluminum dosing, the lack of efficacy, all the red flags and the VARBAC reports. There's a lot of stuff here that people need to be concerned about. So our program here is to educate people. And, Jack, if you have questions about that, why don't you fire away, and I'll try and answer them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a great deal about this offline, but the advice that you have for individuals who are dealing with policymakers or lawmakers who seem to, be unable to process the information that's put in front of them, that's well organized, such as that this is in the HPV vaccine on trial. It's exquisite work. It's really top quality, top notch, world class organized information. There's something in the brain that cancels that out. And so you've decided to, instead of taking an attack on the person, you take an attack on the policy. Is that right?
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate you saying that. That's correct. My humble point of view is that this is a policy. It's a public health policy discussion. And from a public health policy point of view, what we have in Maryland, and every citizen in every state in the union has the same tools available. You have something in your state called a Public Information Act request. If you live in Iowa, or if you live in, let's say, Virginia, Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., there's one other state that mandates this. I would look on the Google or maybe DuckDuckGo and find out what is the Public Information Act request. So you would send a Public Information Act request to your State Department of Health and say, please tell me about the money that's been spent to promote this program in the state. Where's the money going? What is the rate of HPV cancer?
Well, before we move to that, what you're really saying is that there's government money being spent to promote a commercial product by a pharmaceutical company. And that you want to know whether or not there's incentive at the other end in any way that would cause a person to move in that direction. But more the general problem is it's just wrong that the government would spend money to push a commercial product. That's just not what we do.
Well, the state will say, well, we're trying to save lives. But in order to slow it down, file the Information Act, find out how much money has come into your state through lobbying or otherwise to move the product into your kids.
Yeah.
And start sending out emails to your legislators and saying, we want answers. We want to understand why is this program going on. What we found in Maryland with Public Information Act requests was about $150 million. And unfortunately, the rate of cervical cancers, actually, not the endpoints in the study, actual cervical cancers are up 17% in the past 5 years in Maryland.
Yeah.
They're up about 9.5% since 2007 when they first started the process in Maryland. So they promised us a reduction in cervical cancers because of this product. We spent $145 million, and the promise has not come true. This is a public policy problem. It's about money being spent improperly.
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. So focusing on the policy, Mary, what if McDonald's or Burger King decided that they were going to pay legislators to change the policy so that in public schools they could sell their product? The parents would be in an uproar, right? So, I mean, we're looking at a disconnect.
That's the craziness here of, first, huge thanks to Josh for his outstanding work. We all are huge fans of his work. And he's 100% right that, Public Information Act requests and Freedom of Information Act requests can be extremely powerful. They can basically be the basis for legal action. But what he's highlighted is one of the big issues in general with vaccines, and especially for the COVID vaccines, is these public-private partnerships. This idea that the government mandates a commercial product. All these vaccines are commercial products, Jack. We don't make any of them as a government. The FDA also, the corporations pay, the corporations provide the data. It is so, interwoven, this public-private function. And of course, it's just fertile territory for corruption, as we see. And they start to see our kids as literally money-making opportunities. I mean, that's what we're seeing the world over. And it's frightening as hell.
Liability.
The other thing that they're getting free product. And also, on many vaccines, HPV vaccines included, the government is making money because they're licensing patented technology to Merck and GSK for their HPV vaccines.
Yes.
Right. And they're liability free. There aren't many other products like that. Drugs are not. That's not the case for drugs, which is why we have the VICP, that adversarial court that very few people even know about. It's really unjust.
It is unjust, and so Josh, we're gonna say goodbye to you right now. But I want to flash I'm sorry to do this to you, Eileen, but we're going to flash Josh right over your beautiful
That's
face.
okay.
Josh Mazer, Maryland, HPVisSTD.com. Josh, you're a true American hero, standing up
Yes.
for the people who actually, literally, physically don't have the strength to do it for
Right.
themselves.
Thank you,
And
Josh.
want to thank you, Josh. They're all thanking you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank Mary, Eileen, and Kim. These folks are showing us the way. Thank you. I appreciate everything you've done for me. Thank you.
Absolutely, 100%. They're great, great people, and it's an honor to have you updating. So I have a question for you. Do you happen to know whether Merck used any federal monies during their development of their HPV vaccines? Were they given any, like the coronavirus? They throw billions of dollars at these companies to make these vaccines. That's federal research dollars.
Go ahead, Mary.
No, go ahead, Eileen.
No, I was saying that, the development of the vaccine started 20 years ago with many scientists from all over the world, numerous universities in the US. And there were 2 NIH scientists who were at the forefront of vaccine research. Lowy and Kim, the other one?
Schiller. Lowy and Schiller.
How could I forget? They're a duo. And they have patents, and NIH invested in the development, and as a result, NIH earns annual royalties. We don't know how much they do earn. That's for some reason proprietary, even though it's taxpayer money that was invested into this. But there was a 10-year patent war that we talk about in the book between scientists in the US and Australia. So it was well fought out, and Ian Fraser won the day. He actually won royalty rights for, I think, the entire Southern Hemisphere for Gardasil, and he actually patented the technology. So I think Cervarix is included in that, and any future HPV vaccine that uses his technology for VLP, for formulating VLPs, which is the vaccine-like particles, the genetically modified virus particles that are virus-like, yeah.
Virus-like particles, yes. So the
Genetic-
reason why I asked that, the reason why I asked
Well,
that
we
question
don't
is
know.
because if any researcher at any university accepts, a university that accept any federal funding to do research within the university, everything at that university is foiable. Everything can be addressed by Freedom of Information Act. And so the argument, I think, could be made that due to the derivation of the intellectual property originating with, taxpayer dollars, as you correctly said, through the research, and, we could wonder if we could get to some of those communications on percentages of royalties. I mean, it's patently ridiculous that we can't know what our NIH earns from the HPV. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever
not just NIH.
in a free and
it's
open
Lowy.
society.
It's
Lowy
Schiller
and
too.
But what we
money.
do know, Jeff, we don't know dollar amounts, but we do know that from 2007, so the vaccine was approved in mid-2006. So 2007, its first full year in operation, through 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there, it was the number 1 or number 2 earner for NIH royalties. It's since dropped to 3 or 4, and it kind of vacillated between 1 or 2. But for a decade, it stood atop the NIH's earnings.
Right. And the scientists are entitled to a percentage of that. So, and they do declare that as a
themselves get up to $150,000 sort of a bonus every year. I mean, so it's not hard to see how the conflicts of interest are just enormous here.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you had $150,000 riding annually on what you said about a commercial product and you worked for the federal government, how objective could you possibly be being confronted with data from studies that say, hey, you know what, you guys are making it worse? It's a perverse incentive. That's what we call it. It's a perverse incentive.
It's absolutely a perverse incentive.
And they've allowed it with awards. I mean, this has been, Mary, you could do better to this, but is there a monetary prize that goes along with some of the awards
sure.
that they've gotten. It's not only
sure.
it's not
The Lasker Award, yeah, absolutely. I think it was $250,000 is the Lasker Award that Lowy and Schiller each got. Oh yeah, I mean these people are very incentivized to go with the flow. This is lucrative for the federal government. And again, this is so much on display with the COVID-19 vaccines, right? There's these public-private partnerships and the conflicts of interest are just staggering. I mean, how is the NIH going, or how is the FDA going to look objectively on a Moderna vaccine, which the NIH is a co-partner on, and they invested millions of dollars? I mean, it's just not realistic. It's just completely unrealistic.
And in the NIH's agreements, they have a lot of control over communications, even with FDA. It's not all in Moderna's hands. A lot of the boat is being driven by NIH.
Yeah, so we would hope that there would be some recourse, some way that people could find relief from this level of I'll say it, conspiracy and fraud, specifically to warp the public's perception over vaccine safety in general, but in this one in particular. And I've been doing a lot of contemplation lately on the secular foundations of ethics. Without a religious-based foundation, as religion is going by the wayside, where can a people, they turn to the state, without being able to turn to God, people tend to turn to the state. But if you look at the history of the discussions on the origins of ethics that are not religious-based, there is a central theme, and it centers around Immanuel Kant's missive, that you try to generalize your maxims. If I do it for myself, then what would the world look like if everyone did the same act? If it's okay for everyone to do the same act and it doesn't destroy the universe, it doesn't kill everyone, if it doesn't cause net harm, okay, then that's probably a moral thing for me to do. And so I think this goes to this essence of the big shift that's coming, that they say that there's a big reset in the economy. We should have a voice in that discussion. Everyone feels that we're sitting on the precipice of a post-2020 something. We have no idea what it's going to look like. I think we need to remember to an individual, from the president of the United States down to the person that changes, the garbage bags at the NIH, throughout government, throughout university research, throughout society, throughout medical practice. If you're going to have a free market, then don't consume the freedom. Any act that you take upon yourself to better yourself and game the system in whether it's insider trading or unfair competitive practices or having a monopoly when you're not supposed to, gaming the system so that you personally profit at other people's expense, is the actual consumption of the currency of freedom. And it's an individual choice, in my view, every time to do the right thing or not do the right thing. So we need to have individual accountability, not diffuse. FDA did something wrong. Oh, it's the same old. Look at them. They've done this for 20 years. To an individual, they should be held accountable for their disruption of a free and open market economy, and of course to public health. And so that was my little missive at the end. Have you guys thought at that level about a reform of society instead of allowing the status quo of neo-capitalism that we inherited to stay in place, that's just getting worse and worse and worse in a runaway fashion? It's not sustainable by any means. There's a huge collapse coming out that I see from the economics point of view. I mean, for all three of you, I'd like to know, what do you think could be done in the future once we solve the vaccine problem? And I know that's an optimistic thing, but how could we reform our society so that we don't have regulatory capture and so on? What are the steps? How do we start rebuilding something new?
I'll start for everybody, but I think, Jack, I sort of agree with your premise that we have to look to the individual. And I think one of the really dangerous things in this area that we're looking at is, vaccines are for quote unquote population health. We're not looking at, is this good for this child? Is this good for this individual? We're saying, oh, cervical cancer rates have gone down in Australia, or they've gone down in wherever, Sweden. That's not the right way to look from my perspective. I mean, I think we have to look at individual decision making, and we have to look at individual accountability. And what we see when you look at population health, it's a whole different story. If you look at liability protection and mandating something for a population, it's a whole different story. It's sort of like, when one person, if you kill one person, it's murder, but if you kill 1 million people, it's politics. I mean, there's something very dangerous that happens there from the sort of the translation of individual accountability and individual freedom to the population or societal level.
And
I think we also have to get back to critical thinking and teaching people to think critically again, right? We've gotten to a place where, the term that Eileen and I see on Twitter all day, every day is sheeple, right? People are sheeple. And they're not thinking for themselves. And we've seen that with mask mandates. People can't explain really why they're wearing masks, except they've been told to. And this is a personal beef of mine, but people have horrible mask hygiene. I mean, if you're going to wear a mask, you should do it the right way. But people are very accepting, and part of it is fear-based. And I don't know how to do it, but we have to break that bond of fear that people have. I mean, I think a lot of the mask compliance is fear-related. And I think for those who choose to get the COVID vaccine, that's going to be fear-related. And people are afraid to take that. I think they get to a point, and I think George Orwell said something about it, and I will not be nearly as eloquent as Orwell, where you get to a point where you're right at the point where you have to ask the tough questions, and you're afraid to step over and ask those questions because it's a very uncomfortable space to be in, and the answers are not comfortable answers to have to deal with. And how do we, wake up more people to be able to ask those questions? And I think Mary's absolutely right. We need to look at individuality, and we need to have people looking, in many areas of healthcare, we talk about individualized, personalized, patient-centric medicine, and we don't see that with respect to vaccines at all. We see quite the opposite.
Thank you.
And
sorry,
No. There's a little bit of a delay, and we talked over each other. But we were headed that way a little bit with vaccines. There was that idea put out there, I think by Greg Poland. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That there is a space in this world for individualized vaccines. It was going alongside in step with functional medicine. People are craving for this. Individualized look. Instead of the 15 minutes a visit, people want a more holistic approach to health. But unfortunately, 2020 has totally, put a halt to that momentum. And the other thing that we've seen, and it was always there a little bit, we saw it last year in 2019 in New York, where people are holding others accountable for their health, right? And that goes to masks, this nonsensical idea that, you need to wear your mask for me, says the person wearing a mask. It just makes very little sense. And of course, we now know that will extend, it already has, to vaccines, where you need to get your vaccine for me, says the person drinking Coke, eating McDonald's. So we have to take responsibility for our own health and not push that back to your neighbor, not to be pointing the finger at your neighbor. I understand the argument. It always comes back, but what about the immune compromised? They also are responsible for their health. I'm sorry, we don't have a right to demand others take certain actions to protect you, and you hear all the sound.
That could be fleshed out a little bit with some science, because we know that the people who are at highest risk of serious illness under COVID-19, they have what's called a Th2 skew in their immune system.
Right.
So part of why I got booted from LinkedIn, so I can no longer communicate with my 16,000 academic contacts, is I said, We need to change our priorities so that we no longer look at vaccines as the solution. The number one public health priority, given COVID, should be to find those people that have Th2 skew and help them reverse it. That should be number one.
Right. Exactly.
I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish your thought, Eileen. Please finish your thought.
No, it's exactly that. And, take responsibility, test your vitamin D levels, be aware of what it is to be healthy. And, I understand that people are unavoidably sick, genetics and what have you, but that doesn't mean that, I hate this one, but I'm going to put it out there. I won't set my kids on fire to keep yours warm. It's a pretty dramatic image, but, for some people, it comes down to that visceral feeling of, no, I'm not doing that. But moreover, and Mary and Kim know this better, is you don't have the right to demand it of me. But I'm afraid that's going to make its way to the Supreme Court eventually, and we may have a revisit of this fundamental question of what the state can force upon you. And we already have, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and that's still milling around 115 years later and being used now to justify lockdown measures. So we have a very precarious situation coming up. I mean, not only for other reasons that people are watching the Supreme Court issue, but I hope that we will test Jacobson again, and I don't know how that will happen, but hopefully a case will make its way back up where we'll be able to say, you know what, when that was passed, pharmaceutical companies didn't have indemnity. They were, this was a different world. We didn't have 14 vaccines, 50 doses of 14 vaccines by the age of 5. This was about one case and a $5 fine in one county. So I hope that this will be revisited. And
I want to thank you for bringing that up, because one of my greatest frustrations is how routinely Jacobson is misinterpreted. And the first thing that's misinterpreted, and Mary, correct me on this, but the state has limits. The state is not all powerful in its ability to enforce vaccination specifically. And that is written, it's black and white in Jacobson. It's
black and white. Yeah, 1905. I keep saying, hammering, it's not a bad decision for 1905. Eileen is right. It's not dealing with indemnity. It's not dealing with a lot of issues, but it set forth 5 criteria for any vaccine mandate. It has to be necessary. It has to be proportionate. It has to be reasonable. It has to be non-discriminatory, and there has to be harm avoidance. I mean, it's not a blank check, and it's just been grossly misinterpreted since the 1950s, when these mandates started being thrown around like candy.
Exactly. And the option, sorry, let me do this. So the option that was given by Jacobson was choice. It wasn't mandate. It wasn't passive. Right. It wasn't passive aggressive. We're going to deny you the ability to educate your child. We're going to deny your ability to feed your child, as they do in Florida, which really, really fucking pisses me off, that they deny food stamps to families in Florida unless you're up to date on your vaccine. That is inhumane to starve children by making their parents impoverished. The state of Florida is an absolute criminal in my mind. And what I'd like to say is, vaccinate or pay $5. So the next time the state says you have to vaccinate, give them $5 and walk away. And then dare them to arrest you at the door, bringing your child to school. That's what the law said, and then fight them in court. Right. It was not mandated, you must do this or we'll take this away. It was do this or you have to pay some money, and make them hold them accountable to that ruling.
That's exactly right. And actually people don't realize, but, it was never, ever acceptable to strap people down and give them smallpox vaccines. And in fact, when that happened, there's the person who was wrongly vaccinated got a damage award that's worth like $40,000 today. This was only about an administrative fine. Did Reverend Jacobson have to pay the fine or not for choosing not to vaccinate? It had nothing to do with what Alan Dershowitz and others have said is the compulsion. Now, it was misinterpreted to the extreme to permit forced sterilization. That's now recognized as an international war crime. That was Buck v. Bell. So it comes from a bad place, but But Jacobson is not a terrible decision given its criteria. And now, when it imposes on what we know are fundamental rights, the right to informed consent, religious free exercise, parental rights, bodily integrity, privacy, we know that the Supreme Court and any court must apply what we call strict scrutiny. When there's sort of like this balancing between a compelling state interest and a fundamental right, the state has the burden to show that this is the least restrictive means possible. And so these fights over Jacobson, Eileen, are already happening. They're happening very much over abortion access, and they're happening over lockdown measures, and they're also happening over vaccines. Right. And so we are developing a pipeline of cases on interpretation of Jacobson. And a lot of the lower courts right now, they are not taking a sort of an elastic approach to Jacobson when it's not related to vaccines. When it's coming to abortion access and when it's coming to lockdown measures, they're interpreting Jacobson in a much more narrow way. So it's not all negative, actually, when it comes to this, to sort of the precedent right now.
So let me ask you, Mary, there's a concept in law, just to help people know what we're talking about, where it is expected that a judge will interpret the full ruling by the Supreme Court and not cherry pick the bits and pieces of the ruling that they would like. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, Jack. I mean, you know,
I'm asking a question. I don't have a position on it.
No, I don't think that's quite accurate. But I think the way in which Jacobson is being used a lot right now is what can the state do in an emergency? Take away the vaccine issue for a minute, right? It just happened to be like an infectious disease emergency. And so the question is, what are the powers of the state in an emergency? Now, one thing we have to bear in mind is after 2000, after 9/11 and the anthrax scare, people who are very, very pro-vaccine, they implemented a model state statute called the Public Health Emergency Model State Act, something like that. And most states put them into place. And those state acts they permit very draconian measures. So we have a lot stacked against us, right? Also in 2005, after the anthrax scare, Congress passed the Preparedness and Readiness Emergency, PrEP Act of 2005. And, that gives even broader indemnification of vaccine manufacturers, government officials, and healthcare workers than the 1986 Act. And to those who haven't watched Andy Wakefield's new film, The 1986 Act, I highly recommend it because it really does help people to understand how extraordinarily powerful giving liability protection is to an industry.
Okay, thank you. So listen, the last thing that I want to say, and I'll give you guys a round robin and close out thoughts here, is you really need to take a look at Josh's work again, because he published this paper in Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, where he found excess teen suicide risk associated with Gardasil exposure, implications for public health policy. This journal is an IPAC product. It's a project. It may or may not make it for the long run. We're going to try to keep it going. We have some fantastic papers coming out that are just stunningly peer-reviewed, amazing things. But to find that there's public health threats from vaccination programs, that's masked, means to me that we need to dismantle public health as it is and restructure something that actually focuses on health. We actually need to do that, right, and not play defensive. We need to play offensive. Mm-hmm. And I love that we're going after, getting the justice for those that have been harmed. We have to reform medical research. We need to reprioritize and reprogram the biomedical research done at universities in a different way, so the money doesn't go through NIH. They can't be trusted. They never prioritized anything about autism and trying to recover kids or help them detoxify, get the toxins that we know are accumulating in their bodies from the research that's cited in my book on the environmental genetic causes of autism. So the COVID-19 was a blip. I think that it's stressed the system to the point where everything's under the microscope, and I think we made massive gains, actually. We were not set back. I think we made actual massive gains in the awareness that something is not right with vaccine safety science. And we're going to see how that the net effect of that Are you optimistic? Let's do this. Are you optimistic about where we're going? Start with the other lawyer on the panel.
Depends on which day and which time of day you ask me if I'm optimistic or not. I would say cautiously optimistic. I think that the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines have been a wake-up call for a lot of people, and a lot of people are, we've always said about the HPV vaccines that they were kind of a wedge in the door, right? Because there are people who think vaccines are the greatest thing you can do, and giving your child a polio vaccine is going to save them from polio, and while they're sitting in Idaho or something, but they question the HPV vaccine, right? Why does my kid need this? Why do I need it as an adult? And that was a wedge in the door. And I think more people are even asking questions about the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. And they've been forced, what they've done amazingly is force more transparency than we've seen from vaccine manufacturers in a long time, right? They had to release their trial protocols, which are normally highly confidential documents. We need to start digging into them and seeing what's there. But they've had to release those. That didn't happen with Gardasil. We eventually got some of the protocols, but we don't even have all of them. We have a couple of them. So it's huge that those were released. But it's also, eye-opening, and we can use information to wake people up to what's happening here. So one of the things that Children's Health Defense has sort of been leading on this is the idea that, so the Moderna vaccine and some of the other vaccines use a chemical substance called polyethylene glycol to coat the messenger RNA, right? Because it degrades very easily in the blood. It just falls apart. So you need to keep it encapsulated in order to get it into the cell cytoplasm. Over 70% of people are sensitive to polyethylene glycol. And 7 to 8% of those people can have anaphylactic reactions, right? So we're going to be injected. That's a huge, and we're exposed to PEG all day, every day. It's in cosmetics, it's in food, it's in chemicals and cleaning agents. It's everywhere. And that's why we're all sensitive. And they're not testing people before the clinical trials for PEG sensitivity. It's not commercially available test, but there is a research-based test. That's how we know 70% of people are sensitive. And they're not testing people. And that could have a tremendous effect in the population at large. And the other thing, and there's a tie to HPV here, because we see polysorbate 80 sensitivity in the population as well. And there's polysorbate 80 in HPV, and there's a link to anaphylaxis, an association with anaphylaxis and polysorbate 80. And there's been research done on that related to HPV vaccination. There's also a synergistic effect apparently between polysorbate 80 and polyethylene glycol. And as we're, giving these vaccines possibly in tandem or close together, it could be really catastrophic. So I'm hoping that the transparency that's sort of been forced, the questions that people are being forced to ask, really start to wake people up. I mean, I've even had people coming to me asking me, someone heard on New Jersey radio a couple days ago, a friend of mine, well, I heard that and this is regular, relatively mainstream radio. I heard that the flu vaccine could increase your risk of getting COVID-19. I was like, let me just send you some research on that. So word is getting out even on things like that, as there's this big push to give everyone the flu vaccine, right?
Yeah.
So I think people are becoming more aware and they are asking more questions, but we just need to get bigger inroads. And it's so hard to get, as Mary started off early on, talking about the media exposure to discuss these issues. And you have a big following, so we're really happy to be here tonight to talk about these issues, because I think they really are critical. We've reached such a strange time in this country and in this world. I mean, a year ago, I couldn't have predicted that we'd be where we are. I'm not sure how many people could have, but I think it is time for a real wake-up call and a real reset. And I don't know what that reset looks like, but I'm cautiously excited about it.
Good. Eileen.
Sure. I all of what Kim said in terms of vaccine hesitancy for the mainstream now, 50% are hesitant. Welcome to the club. They don't want to be in this club, but it's happened. Sorry.
Like you did, right?
I volunteered. But well, somebody volunteered me. But if 2020 were to say, wow, this is a bad year, 2021 is going to say, hold my beer. I mean, when you look at politicians like Governor Cuomo already saying that he wants to be the first state to fully vaccinate its 19 million citizens. Now that means everybody, children, adults, elderly, sick, pregnant, you name it. That's his goal. He wants to be the first state to eliminate COVID-19 via vaccination.
Talk about projection. Oh my God.
Policies. And, I've done a lot of research on the 1976 swine flu, epidemic and the policies. The politicians there were making nonsense decisions as well and talking about how they don't know the science, but they're just going to have to make a call on it. And I find that this is happening in plain sight. Every press conference that these governors, put out, it's crazy. I'm always asking on Twitter, was there an epidemiologist with you when you made that decision? Are you consulting with an economist? We are working from a single variable of risk, which is unheard of in the history of economics, of any sphere of business that you care to mention. We don't shut down highways because there's accidents. We mitigate the risk. Many variables of risk with many different methods, right? This is looking at COVID-19 as the single one enemy of this world. And, if you look to other diseases that we don't vaccinate for in the US, tuberculosis, there's hundreds of thousands of deaths a year that nobody, gives a mention to. So I fear for policy. I feel like, especially right now, the politics of pushing the vaccine to November, and I'm not going to mention who's saying what, where, but I think it's nonsense pushing this vaccine out. But it's a blessing in a way because people are waking up to that. But not only the general public, you have market watch websites. People should follow Stat News. They are doing an amazing job of keeping tabs on Moderna and Pfizer. They're taking no prisoners in their analysis of Moderna, especially. And, they are doing an excellent job. You can't call Stat News anti-vaccine, but, they're being honest. And right now, this is the only time you can be honest. But if I say something about it, I'm the anti-vaxxer. But thank goodness we have outlets like Stat News, delivering the truth also, so we can point to them and say, future anti-vaxxer or just sensible journalist looking at the facts. And that's what we need to address. And the politics is driving me crazy on the vaccine issue. That needs to stop. And people are going to get hurt. That's the issue here. And as much as I want everybody to, I want everyone to see for themselves the danger, but I don't want people to get hurt in order to see it. I want them to look at the data when it comes out. I want respectable journalists to look at the data. And I don't want FDA to rubber stamp it. But millions of doses have already been manufactured. It's a disaster and it's happening. We can't stop it. All we can do is shine a big spotlight on it, which I think we're doing.
Excellent. Excellent. Mary?
Well, I would second everything that Kim and Eileen have said. I guess to me, as you point out, Jack, the issue is much bigger than just vaccines. It really is essentially dismantling public health. Public health has just not led us to greater health and prosperity. It's not enabled us to preserve our democracy. We've created through quote unquote public health, really potentially a real totalitarian nightmare ahead of us. So I think once we beat this dragon, to a pulp, we're really going to have to completely abandon where we were with public health and really redesign so that things like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, really has meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all. So there's a massive education effort underway. This is part of it. On Breaking Science, our goal is to make sure that science survives this major reset I started on Breaking Science before coronavirus. I'm worried that it's dying on the vine. Science itself is a for-profit marketing enterprise by and large for vaccines and for medicines. And the fact that they came up with and just, derived this childhood bipolar depression so that they could move medicine from one market to an infant. But your 2-year-old doesn't have bipolar. Okay. So these are criminal acts in my mind, and the personal accountability. I guess I'll leave people with a word of inspiration that came to me as we're having this talk, which is the next time somebody calls you a conspiracy theorist, remind them that the Declaration of Independence was a conspiracy. By definition, what we're doing is a conspiracy, ladies. And I hope nobody's watching because it's out there and our secrets are going to travel far and wide because they're going to find us. Listen, you guys are stars, rock stars, in my view. You rank up there with Judge Strickland, who in PA shot down Governor Wolf and said, no, the state has limits. Just like Eileen said so eloquently, you can't shut down the entire society due to an emergency that has no end. That's if the new norm is protect the elderly and the rest of us have 0.0001% chance of, okay, when I'm elderly, please don't come visit me if you're sick or been in contact with somebody by coronavirus, but go ahead and live your life. It's unbelievable the burden that we're putting on our children, unfathomable that we're putting the burden of our fear on our children. Think about that. Be an adult, take the risk, and join in society and stand up for yourself, people. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, all three of you. This has been a fantastic interchange, and I look forward to great news on those lawsuits.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you so much.
Right on.
Thank
you.